If you'll put my slides up for me. A couple of months ago, Holly contacted me and said, I need the title of your presidential address. And I thought, a what? I thought it was just the presidential address. I hadn't begun to figure out what I was going to speak about, much less give it a title. Well, we've kicked around several, and you may have to help me decide. It's my job is a term occasionally heard around our office. It's usually heard from me as I'm exiting a patient's room. Every now and then we'll have a patient who's actually happy and expresses appreciation for the care that they've received and how they're feeling. My mother taught me a long time ago never to turn down a compliment. It's probably a supreme insult. But mostly I just say, that's my job, that's what we're here for. About 2 months ago, we were sitting at home watching ESPN, and John Gruden was talking about Gruden's grinders. And my daughter Ellen asked, what's a grinder? Well, grinders, by definition, are individuals who succeed through hard work and determination rather than exceptional skill. Well, if I've accomplished anything, it certainly wasn't through exceptional skill. Through AANA, I've been around some remarkably talented people, and I can at least tell the difference. But hard work and determination can help you to accomplish a lot. Legacies are as much about those who got you where you are as they are about what you leave behind. So which of these is this next 30 minutes about? I guess I'll have to let you decide. On that note, I do hope you're enjoying this 33rd annual meeting of the Arthroscopy Association of North America here in beautiful South Florida. For many of you, I suspect it's a long-needed respite from the harsh winter that's just behind us. We're being treated to a magnificent program thanks to the guidance of our program chair, Commander Matt Provencher, and the hard work of his entire committee. He's been ably assisted by Ben Schaefer, chair of the Education Committee, and his entire team as well. Truman said, it's amazing how much you can accomplish when you don't care who gets the credit. And this clearly exemplifies an AANA mantra. As an organization, AANA truly is a meritocracy. It's an association where individuals are acknowledged and singled out based on their contributions and not their connections or where they come from. Otherwise, how do you think an old boy from Nashville who's a solo practitioner could be standing before this auspicious gathering? To give you a personal perspective, in 2003, I was going to slow down and not travel as much. I had resigned my position with the Tennessee Titans, although that didn't last long. I didn't submit anything for the AANA annual meeting and didn't even plan to attend. In fact, I'd bought a new set of clubs and was taking more golf lessons, thinking I would focus more on my game. However, Ron Sparks asked if I would come out and do an evening program at AANA, so at the last minute I went. I didn't even arrive until late Thursday afternoon. This was the year that the new Marriott in Phoenix had just opened, and we were one of the first meetings to be held there. Registering at the hotel, 2 people stopped to congratulate me. In return, I said thanks and nodded, having no idea on earth what they were talking about. Walter Shelton was the 3rd person who stopped me to offer congratulations. And finally, I had to ask him what he was congratulating me for. Turns out I'd been voted onto the AANA Board of Directors. I was certainly very honored, although I didn't really feel like I knew why. I did my 3 years on the board, shook hands, said thanks, and parted ways. Then I remember in 2006, when the Academy meeting was in Chicago, having been moved there from New Orleans because of Hurricane Katrina, I attended the AANA faculty reception following Specialty Day. I found myself approached by 2 of the AANA past presidents who said they thought I should pursue the AANA presidency. My immediate thought was that was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard of. It took me a while to figure out that maybe AANA saw more in me than I saw in myself. I think it's very true that AANA can bring out the best in people and provide them opportunities to utilize their talents and interest in education, research, and patient advocacy. Frankly, I would have to say that on a selfish level, I've had so many things working for me that if I were to fail at this point, I'd really have to go out of my way. Newton said, if I've seen further, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants. Well, man, I've stood on some big ones. As an aside, I have to qualify my statements by saying that I'm the worst person on earth for someone to ask for career advice. That's because there's nothing in my career that I set out or planned to do. I didn't plan to go to medical school. I didn't plan to be an orthopedic surgeon. I didn't plan to have a special interest in hip arthroscopy. And I certainly didn't plan to be president of the Arthroscopy Association of North America. Basically, my life and my career have just evolved based on the circumstances in which I found myself. And I've been incredibly blessed by the Lord through all of this. My mother still chuckles about all the different jobs I would hold down at once, none of which amounted to much and usually paid nothing more than minimum wage. The only steady job I ever had was teaching scuba diving through college and medical school. I guess it's good to know I've got a fallback position if this doctor stuff doesn't work out. I say there's nothing I've done and nothing I accomplished that I set out to do. That is except this. When I was an intern in Louisville, Louisville wasn't exactly the strongest program around at the time, and trust me, I was lucky to have even gotten a spot there. One of the chief residents, Darrell Dogmeat Lowry, got a fellowship with Dr. Andrews. And he was always talking about Dr. Andrews this and Dr. Andrews that. Well, I had no idea what a Dr. Andrews was, but it certainly sounded like the thing for me. I also knew that there was nothing to separate an also-ran from Louisville from anyone else. So starting my first year of residency, I would take my vacation time and go visit Dr. Andrews in Columbus, Georgia. After about 3 years of this stuff, I think he said, I guess we're going to have to give you a fellowship. Well, there's no way Dr. Andrews could bestow upon me his God-given surgical skills, but hopefully I learned something. Perhaps more importantly, through his example, I saw how to treat special people like they were regular folks and how to treat regular folks like they're special. Like many of you, I've stood on the shoulders of my greatest giant, my father. He was a general surgeon who began his medical career in the military, serving the Stonewall Jackson Brigade of the 29th Infantry. During World War II, he oversaw the medical evacuation of Normandy Beach, an action in which they lost 75% of their officers in the first 24 hours. Fortunately, he was part of the 25%. During his time in the European theater, he earned 2 Purple Hearts and was awarded the Bronze Star with 2 Oak Leaf Clusters and the Silver Star. He dedicated his career to fighting cancer, which is a much more admirable pursuit than anything I'll accomplish. In the 40s and 50s, the cause of cancer was largely unknown, and there was always a stigma associated with it. It was felt that if you contracted cancer, you must have done something wrong. His main focus was breast cancer, and he spent decades debunking myths. In the 60s, he completed a landmark longitudinal study that showed that the single greatest factor in survival from breast cancer was early detection. In the 60s and 70s, he traveled extensively to places like China and Egypt and Russia, where Americans didn't go. But these governments understood the destructive power of cancer, and he led delegations to educate their medical communities. He was a solo practitioner for over 50 years. Along the way, he was president of the American Cancer Society, the Chamber of Commerce, the Nashville Academy of Medicine, the Exchange Club, Leadership Nashville, the medical staff of the Junior League Home for Crippled Children. He was chairman of the board of overseers of the Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center. He was chairman of the board of Cheekwood, our most recognized museum, and the board of trust for the Hermitage, which was the home of President Andrew Jackson. He served on the board of a major bank and an insurance corporation. He was also the Sunday school director, a deacon and elder for First Presbyterian Church. I think you get the picture. The 60s and 70s was certainly a time of social revolt and rebellion, and we kids weren't any different. Still, among many of my brother's friends, my father's nickname was God, and they meant it with reverence. This was a stylized photograph that one of them had taken. Anything good I've accomplished, I credit to my father and Dr. Andrews. The bad stuff I figured out on my own. Basically, I'm just a cheap imitation of my father, and I don't mean this in a self-deprecating way, it's just the truth. In so many ways, I was probably even more influenced by my mother. She was a child of the Depression. They were certainly among the more fortunate, but it was a time that affected the haves and the have-nots alike. I'd be surprised if many in the audience know what these are. These are hobo markings used to communicate information among the migratory jobless masses during the 20s and 30s. My mother's home was near the railroad tracks, and they always set an extra place at the dinner table in case someone arrived unexpectedly. This often happened, and they always felt their home was probably marked, knowing that friendly people lived there and food could be had. My mother can easily be described as generous and frugal in the same sentence. I remember her saying, "I don't mind spending money, but I hate wasting it." That's a concept I've used a lot in this last year during our financial discussions for AANA. She would give you anything you needed, but would not leave the light on in the room when she left because she didn't want to waste the electricity. I don't want to bore you with anecdotes, but if any project we would work on, she would insist that you had to have the right tools for the job, and they had to be good quality. Trying to do it with anything less was nonsense. Boy, if you don't think that doesn't spill over to my operating room home today, you need to come visit Nashville. My mother was a powerful woman, is a powerful woman, who detests attention. For the last 50 years, our family has gathered for lunch every Sunday at our country club. With 6 siblings and extras, it's usually a pretty busy occasion. She would never be seen in one of these photographs because she never goes. She finds it to be too much of a spectacle. And with that, maybe Kevin Plancher can understand why I just couldn't seem to make it to the faculty entertainment at his meeting this last December. Although not deliberate, I believe my mother instilled in me some of what has been affectionately referred to as the Caldwell temper. I hide it pretty well, but more than occasionally it comes out, and there's at least a few people in this auditorium who can attest to it. We've been around Nashville a while. I have some relatives who still live on land that was deeded to the family by the King of England. My great-great-grandfather, Major John W. Thomas, was long rumored to have run guns for the South during the war between the states. After the war, he became president of the railroad and worked feverishly to rebuild Nashville as a cultural center. Nashville became known as the Athens of the South because of its many colleges and universities. He was known as a man of great character and remember those around him. No veteran ever had to pay for passage on his railroad. Another great-grandfather moved to Nashville as a child when his widowed mother was chased off their property on the Yazoo River in Mississippi when Grant's gunboats were laying siege to Vicksburg. He became one of Nashville's business leaders and took particular pride in hiring talented young men that he knew would leave and develop their own success stories. I think this is a lot like mentoring that is nurtured through AANA. We try to identify and nurture talented young surgeons and then watch them flourish into new thought leaders. During the first part of the last century, my great-uncle was described as the most powerful man in the South. He built his career betting on the South's economic recovery. Even in the 50s and 60s, up until his death, the major power brokers would gather for lunch at his home. The newspaper said you could tell the day of the week by who was eating lunch on his porch. Occasionally, my father would take me along for visits. Through his career, Uncle Rogers always had a sign prominently displayed in his home. It said, "When in this house, please do not say anything unkind about anyone, bearing in mind that what you think of others is nothing like as important as what others might think of you." I've always wanted to put this sign in my office, but I knew I just could never live up to the message. In many circles, I have to be quick to point out to people that I'm not a hip preservation surgeon. I'm just a sports medicine doc who happens to have taken an interest in hip problems. Like most arthroscopists and sports medicine physicians, my career centered more around the knee and the shoulder. I've always enjoyed elbow arthroscopy because Dr. Andrews taught me how to do it, and it was something that was different than most people were doing. Thus, I probably wrote more about elbow at a time than I was doing tons more knees and shoulders. Did I mention there's nothing in my career that I set out to do? Nothing except stalk Dr. Andrews? Well, that was true about hip arthroscopy. This is just something that evolved, eventually taking on a life of its own, sparked by some earlier comments that I'll reflect on. In 1990, one of my partners had a 16-year-old kid with a bunch of loose bodies in his hip, 2 years following closed treatment of an acetabular fracture. She was planning to do an arthrotomy to remove the fragments and asked me if I thought I could do anything arthroscopically. Actually, Dr. Andrews had envisioned this for me years before. But at this point, I'd never seen one and certainly had never done one. But I thought as long as we didn't do something dumb like cut the femoral nerve, we could try, and when it didn't work, she could flip him over and do a formal arthrotomy. This is that first case. We just used the techniques Dr. Andrews had taught me for any joint. We used the biggest shaver we had for getting loose bodies out. A lot of them wouldn't come through that. We grabbed the biggest cannula we could find and flushed them through the cannula. Some of them we just had to freehand, so we borrowed some pituitaries from the spine surgeon. But it worked. After that, about once a year, someone would land on my doorstep with loose bodies to be removed. So after 2 years, we'd done 3 loose bodies, and that's when one of our therapists came to me and said, "I've been rehabbing these hips with loose bodies. I think my brother has loose bodies in his hip. He'd been in a motorcycle accident 14 years before and had hip problems ever since. He used to work framing houses, but had to give up his job because he never knew when his hip would go out on him. We did x-rays, MRI, a CT scan, all of which were normal. Keeping in mind, MRIs weren't any good back then anyway. I thought, well, maybe he got some type of radiolucent loose bodies that we just can't see on the studies. So after 14 years of symptoms, it didn't seem premature to consider the role of arthroscopy. I fully expected it to be a normal hip scope, and I thought if I'm going to scope a normal hip, we might as well make a good educational video out of it. So we set it up to film it inside and out. And here's this case, putting the scope in. And as we look, the first thing we encounter is this bucket handle tear of his labrum flipped up inside the hip. We excised this, and after 14 years, his symptoms were gone. And that's when a little light went off in my head and said, you know, there's other things going on inside the hip besides the loose bodies that we're just not really well aware of. I think that's probably the landmark case that set us on the journey that continues today. By the way, here's his x-ray 20-something years later. His x-rays are normal and he's still pain-free. But that's a point for a different story. I tell people I've only done two smart things in my life. One was marry my wife, and the other was in 1993. I had no idea where this hip arthroscopy stuff was going, but I didn't want to get years down the road and be trying to guess back on how these patients had been doing. So we started collecting our data on our outcomes. This has subsequently become the foundation for much of the work that we've done. So for the young surgeons in the audience, I encourage you to start following your data early in your career. You may have unique aspects of your practice that may turn out to be especially meaningful to others, but you may not know it for a long time to come. In 1994, we published the technique that we developed on performing hip arthroscopy in the supine position. This was based on our vast experience with 12 cases. There's an important message here. For the young people, or really any of you in small practices, you don't have to have had experience with thousands of something before you may have something meaningful to share. Each of you may have unique aspects of your practice and your experiences that may bring light to a meaningful nugget of knowledge that could be benefit to many. The key is observation. Pay attention to what you see and constantly be trying to put it together. Speaking of observations, how many of you perform hip arthroscopy? How many of you are familiar with the C sign? How many of you know that I described the C sign? Well, you're wrong. I said the smartest thing I ever did was keeping track of our data early on. Well, that's really not true. The smartest thing I ever did was hiring this scrappy young nurse back in 1993 who's been keeping track of the patients and me ever since. One day, Kay commented to me, you know, have you ever noticed that some of these patients with hip problems tend to cup their hand above the trochanter, gripping their fingers down in the groin? Kind of makes it look like a C. So it really should be called the K sign. The point is that observation is a powerful tool and not necessarily possessed by some of the most brilliant people. It's amazing how much you can learn if you just pay attention to what's in front of you. Kay came on board partnering with my assistant Sharon Simmons, who was a seasoned veteran of 4 years, which seemed like an awfully long time back then. I think Sharon and I just sort of inherited each other. The two of them have been telling me what to do ever since, and I do acknowledge that following instructions is a skill worth possessing. More importantly, I strongly believe that you need to surround yourself with good people. Don't accept mediocrity. It'll drag you down. But also, don't expect of others what you might expect of yourself, because we sometimes do unreasonable things. I remember one time, a paper I'd written, the reviewers wanted to know who were the other authors that I left off because the methodology referred to what we did, although I was the only author. I explained to them that there really isn't anything that I do or accomplish truly by myself, but I made the grammatical correction anyway. This is true for everyone in this room. If you've accomplished anything meaningful and feel like it was the results of your own ability, you better look closely to see who you're leaving out. Our center, Nashville Sports Medicine, isn't about Thomas Byrd, and it's not about Kay Jones or Sharon Simmons. It's about the patients that we have the privilege to treat. It takes all of us. We're each a unique and essential element in the comprehensive approach that we are blessed to be able to provide to our patients. Karen Griffin was Karen Middleton when I first met her in Columbus, Georgia, where she was Dr. Andrews' right-hand person in physical therapy. She is unquestionably one of the most remarkable physical therapists I've ever met. Frankly, I'm not sufficiently qualified to make that judgment, but I've had so many other therapists tell me the same thing that I know it to be true. Karen went with Dr. Andrews when he moved to Birmingham. Fortunately, she fell in love with a guy from Nashville and moved here. Karen and I have worked together and known each other now for over 30 years. Karen helped to train and handpicked Erica Elsasser to be our go-to hip therapist. At this point, I'd put Erica up against anyone in the world with her ability to assess and manage hip disorders. Beth Potts, our nurse practitioner, is the newest member of the team. Just a baby, she's been with us the last 4 years. Among her many skills, she's a master of ultrasonography, and I'd put her up against anyone in the world with her ability to visualize and inject anything and everything around the hip. Lorraine has been manning the front desk for 24 years. I can't tell you what it means for a patient who hadn't been in your office in 10 years, and they come in and they're greeted by the same face that was there 10 years before. And most times she remembers their name. Linda has been shooting our x-rays for 23 years. So did I mention I think it's important to surround yourself with good people? Now back to this paper. When the supine position manuscript was accepted for publication, the editor-in-chief for the Arthroscopy Journal provided some personal comments on how to improve my practice. Not how to improve the paper, but how I could improve the care that I provided to my patients. By this time, label tears were the most common problem we were encountering. There were only 3 articles in the literature, and they all described posterior label tears. But in my practice, I was seeing anterior label tears. Why was my experience different? In fact, the tears were more around where my portals were coming in anteriorly. Was I creating these tears? I had lots of questions, and I didn't like some of the potential answers. So what did we do? I wrote a paper about it. In 1996, we submitted a paper to the Arthroscopy Journal on label tears. The editor-in-chief said, it's a good paper, but you can make it better. They converted it to a current concepts article. The next thing I knew, I was on the editorial board. And eventually, the editor-in-chief appointed me an associate editor. As a reviewer, I felt like I'd stole something. I wasn't a good author, not that I'm a good author now, but I'm a whole lot better than I was. By reviewing articles, I got to learn immensely through others' experiences. I could emulate manuscript preparation strategies that I found appealing, and I would also see things that I learned that I wouldn't do. Like Forrest Gump said about shrimping, being an associate editor is tough. It's a lot of work. It was then, and it's especially so now. My hat's off to those guys in the trenches today. But when I became an associate editor, that's when I really lit it up. Like a voyeur, I could peer at how a legion of talented reviewers would dissect the labor of other authors. I really got to learn vicariously through the toils of others. I could adopt writing styles and methodologies and learned a lot of things that could be the death sentence to even the best work. I wrote an editorial about this one time entitled How to Be a Better Author Without Really Trying. However, it was years before it really dawned on me what this experience really meant. It finally registered that it's amazing how much you can gain personally through service to others. I bring closure to a year at the helm of AANA. I'm humbled by those who preceded me, as well as those who will follow. So as we start to wrap this up in healthcare, we do have challenges before us. Last year, Nick was definitely the right person at the right time. And I'm supremely confident that we're poised to once again have the right person at the right time when Bill Beach takes over as president. No one possesses a superior skill set for helping AANA and its nearly 4,000 members to navigate through the poorly charted waters of healthcare reform. So where are we in closing this last 30 minutes of ruminations? Well, we each have a job to do, and we should try to do it the best we can. Grinders are good. And with regards to legacy, it doesn't have to be about bricks and mortar or Legion of Fellows. Just look in the mirror. Each of us has an opportunity to leave our own legacy, whether it's the influence we have on colleagues or other healthcare providers, junior partners, senior partners, and of course, most importantly, the patients we treat. It's all about how we influence the lives around us. I'll just close by saying greetings from Nashville, and as we sometimes say, bye-bye. Thank you.